The silence came first. For 117 years, I had served as Astropath Prime of the Sol System, my soul bound to the radiant fire of the Golden Throne since the day the ritual brands seared his mark into my flesh. Through plague and rebellion, through the death cries of worlds swallowed by fire, through the endless cacophony of 10,000 desperate voices crying out across the galaxy, there had always been the light, his light. Constant as a star, steady as the heartbeat of creation, it burned with the warmth of a mother's hand upon a fevered brow. The Astronomicon had been my North Star, my compass through the storm, my anchor against the roiling madness of the warp. It was the one certainty in a universe drunk on chaos. And then, without warning, it died. The moment arrived without fanfare, without celestial tremors, without the terrible grandeur one might expect when the very heart of mankind ceased to beat. I was seated within my sanctum deep beneath the Himalayan peaks, monitoring the psychic traffic that coursed through Terra's orbital relays when it struck me. It was not pain. I almost wished it had been. No, it was absence, an emptiness so absolute, so profound, that every nerve recoiled as though from a flame that burned colder than any winter. The warmth that had lived within my chest for more than a century simply vanished, leaving in its place a chill that sank into my marrow, heavy with the memory of lifeless, frozen worlds. My augmetic fingers, clumsy things installed after a warp burn decades ago, trembled as they brushed the rune-marked surface of the communications console. The display wavered. Once, twice, and then the psychic channels fell into darkness. In the span of a single heartbeat, the invisible threads that bound Terra to the farthest corners of the Imperium were severed, cut clean as if by some cosmic blade. I reached outward with my mind, desperate, casting myself into the immaterium as I had countless times before. But what I found there was beyond all reason. The warp's currents, once chaotic yet navigable, had been obliterated. Their familiar tides were gone, and in their place rose something raw, primal, and hostile beyond imagining. The immaterium had become a black ocean of fury and despair, waves of raw malice rising higher than thought could grasp, colliding with the shriek of tortured metal. The Astronomicon was not dimmed, not faltering, not flickering. It was gone, utterly extinguished. In its place lingered only the faintest psychic echo, like the afterimage of a star burned into one's sight before vanishing forever. And in that moment, clarity pierced me like a spear. I knew what had happened. The God Emperor of mankind, the Master of the Golden Throne, the Light of Terra, the last and only shield of our species, was dead. My first coherent thought was absurd, even pathetic. I wondered whether I ought to file a report. The ridiculousness of it overcame me, and I laughed. Not the laughter of joy, but the ragged sound of a mind unraveling at the edges. A report? To whom? To the High Lords of Terra, who even now must be discovering their calamity firsthand. To the Adeptus Astronomica, whose sacred duty had been annihilated in an instant. Or perhaps to the trillion souls scattered across the galaxy, who were about to learn that their God had been mortal all along. The laughter died in my throat as the first tremor shuddered through the mountain. The sensors called it seismic, but I knew better. This was no mere movement of Earth. This was the fabric of reality itself, groaning beneath the weight of what had occurred. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's will had been the dam restraining the flood of chaos. His death did not simply snuff out a light. It shattered that dam, tearing it away in an instant, unleashing an ocean of nightmares upon our fragile realm. I forced myself to rise, though my legs quaked beneath me. The sanctum's walls, carved from the eternal stone of Terra's mightiest peaks, pulsed with a rhythm not their own. The sacred oils that had shielded us for millennia were already turning to smoke, their wards failing as the warp pressed itself hungrily against the veil of real space. I tasted copper on the air, and beneath it, something else. Something foul, indescribable, so vile that even my enhanced senses recoiled, as though some vast predator had just drawn its first breath in the dark. The silence was broken, and the galaxy would never know peace again. It was the taste of ending, the flavor of finality, a future that would never arrive. 3 minutes after the silence began, the first Vox transmission reached me. The voice belonged to the man who had succeeded Captain General Valder, though in that instant his name eluded me. His words were clipped and precise, the cadence of a soldier trained to command. But beneath that brittle professionalism, I heard it. Panic. All stations. This is the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. We have a Code Omega event in progress. All personnel are to maintain their posts and await further orders. The throne room is sealed. No one enters without my direct authorization. Repeat, Code Omega. Code Omega. The designation had always been theoretical, a whispered specter in the archives of forbidden knowledge. I had seen it buried within the most classified texts, mentioned only in hushed tones by those reckless enough to contemplate the unthinkable. For millennia, it had been nothing more than a shadow. Now it was real. Now it thundered across the Vox with the grim certainty of a funeral bell. More transmissions followed in a flood, each one layering horror upon horror, a mosaic of an Imperium already fracturing at its core. The Imperial Fist garrison at the Lionsgate spaceport reported riots surging through the hive levels below, begging for immediate reinforcement. The Departmentum Munitorum issued system-wide rationing decrees, desperate to maintain order as panic spread. And most unsettling of all, the Adeptus Mechanicus announced the sudden withdrawal of their tech priest from Terra's critical systems. Their explanation was simple yet ominous. Unforeseen complications in the machine spirits. I knew the truth. I could feel in my bones. Every mechanism touched by the Omnisia's blessing was keening like a wounded animal. The death of the Emperor was echoing through them like a phantom pain. Their semi-sentient spirits could no longer comprehend a universe where their divine creator's presence was absent. Within hours, perhaps less, vital systems across the Imperium would begin to fail, driven not by sabotage or neglect, but by the madness of machines grieving a god. The second tremor struck harder than the first. This time, I saw it with my own eyes. Cracks spread across the sanctum's stone walls, thin fractures glowing with a sickly, phosphorescent light. And from those glowing seams came a sound that curdled the blood in my veins. Laughter. Not the laughter of men, nor of any living thing I had ever known. It was cruel, alien, echoing with malice older than human history. The creatures of the warp had noticed. They knew the barriers were weakening. I activated my personal Vox link, reaching out desperately to my fellow astropaths scattered across the Sol system. 3 channels returned only static. The 4th offered something worse. It gave me screaming. Astropath Terminus Yelin, stationed aboard the orbital defense platform Vigilant Guardian for half a century, finally broke through the interference. Her voice was hardly human anymore, slipping between high Gothic and some primeval tongue that clawed at the edges of sanity. Between the gibberish, I caught fragments of meaning. The platform's void shields were fluctuating wildly. Weapons batteries were firing at phantoms that did not exist. The crew were bleeding spontaneously, their minds unraveling under visions no mortal could withstand. The warp itself was bleeding through the walls of reality. I severed the link before her shrieking consumed me, and opened another channel. This time, Astropath Prime Hadrian answered from the fortress monastery of the Imperial Fists. His tone was steadier, but his words carried a dread far heavier than Yelin's madness. Carter, by the throne, you're still transmitting. Listen to me. We're in crisis. The chapter master has ordered a full withdrawal from the outer defenses. Everything, every squad, every gun battery pulled back to the inner keep. Withdrawal, in the Emperor's name. I asked him why. His answer chilled me to the marrow. Because the outer walls are compromised. Not by siege, not by bombardment, not by any enemy we know, by something else. The stone itself was failing. An hour earlier, Chapter Librarian Taurus had attempted a divination ritual. What he saw shattered his mind. He had to be restrained, but not before he screamed about the crawling dark and the laughter echoing through the stone. His madness struck me harder than any physical blow. If the Imperial fists, the most unyielding defenders of Terra, were retreating from their posts, then the truth was far worse than I had feared. Their fortress monastery had endured the siege of Terra itself, had withstood 10 millennia of ceaseless war without yielding a single meter of ground. For them to fall back now could only mean that what they faced lay beyond the reach of any conventional defense. "What are your orders, Prime?" Adrian's voice carried across the Vox, heavy with desperate hope. He spoke as if my words might hold some salvation, as though I could offer an answer where none existed. But I had no orders to give. The chain of command that had endured for 10,000 years was dissolving, unraveling in step with the rest of the Imperium. Without the Emperor's guiding hand, without the Astronomicon to bind us together, we were not an empire anymore. We were fragments, a scattering of isolated systems, each left to face the encroaching dark alone. "Maintain your position as long as possible," I told him, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "And pray this is not the end of all things." The third tremor struck then. A section of the sanctum's ceiling gave way, showering me in ancient stone and mortar once consecrated with holy oils. When the dust cleared, I saw the crack in the far wall had widened. From it seeped something that was not holy shadow and not holy light. It moved with intention, crawling across the floor like liquid mercury. Where it touched the sanctified stone, smoke hissed upward, and the rock itself began to blister and bubble. I drew my last pistol, though I knew it would achieve nothing. Already its machine spirit was faltering. The power cell flickered, its sacred code struggling to hold coherence. Within the hour, every weapon, every vehicle, every engine of war across the Imperium would suffer the same fate. The death of the Emperor had unmoored their spirits. Without his presence to anchor them, the half-living souls of our technology were unraveling into madness. The shadow creature began to rise, smoke taking on the cruel outline of a form. I caught glimpses, horns twisting upward, fangs dripping, eyes like embers of hate. It was not yet whole, but soon it would be. And this was only the beginning. With each passing moment, the barriers weakened further. Soon, horrors uncountable would pour through every fracture in reality. I closed my eyes and cast my soul outward once more, flinging my psychic senses into the roiling madness of the warp. The vision that came confirmed every dread that had haunted me. The galaxy was dying. I saw the great warp lanes collapsing, the arteries that had carried ships and messages between a million worlds for millennia. One by one, those corridors winked out, consumed by storms of raw chaos erupting wherever the emperors had once held sway. And in that vision, I knew this was not the death of a man. It was the death of an age. Naval vessels caught mid-transit were being torn apart by the sudden turbulence of the warp. Navigators, robbed of the Astronomicon's guiding beacon, were struck blind in an instant, their minds flayed by the void's howling. Crews were left to madness and death, abandoned in the endless black between stars. On Macridge, the proud bastion of the Ultramarines, the chapter mustered its full strength for a war it could not hope to win. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar had issued a call to arms that would never be answered, his rallying cry dissolving into the psychic static, now drowning interstellar communication. The noble Space Marines would fight, as they always had, but this time they would fight alone, cut off from their brother chapters, from the Imperial command structure that had sustained them for 10,000 years. Meanwhile, the forge world of Mars was beginning to unravel. The tech priests of the cult Mechanicus struggled to comprehend a universe in which the Omniscia was truly dead. Ancient machines that had functioned flawlessly for millennia seized and failed, their machine spirits collapsing under the theological shock of their creator's demise. Within days, the Red Planet would become a tomb world, its surface littered with the husks of broken engines and the bodies of priests who had perished trying to commune with spirits that no longer answered. But even that catastrophe paled beside what I perceived within the Eye of Terror. That great wound in reality, held in check for 10,000 years by the Emperor's will, had begun to swell. The Chaos Gods, no longer constrained by his presence, poured their full attention into real space. The barriers that separated the warp from the material universe were cracking beneath their assault. Soon demons would stride openly upon every imperial world, and humanity would discover what it truly meant to face the unbridled fury of the dark gods. I opened my eyes to find the shadow thing nearly complete. Its form, though still translucent, was recognizably demonic. Too many limbs ending in claws that dripped with ichor, which hissed and steamed where it touched the sanctified floor. Its eyes were pits of molten gold, beautiful and terrible all at once. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of children weeping. Astropath, it whispered, a tone at once mocking and pitying. Do you see now? Do you understand what your god's death has wrought? I raised my lost pistol, though my hand trembled so badly I could barely keep the weapon steady. I do not speak with demons. No. The creature's laughter was like glass shattering. Then what have you been doing for the past century? Every message you sent, every soul whisper guided through the warp, every prayer you offered to your corpse god, all of it filtered through our realm. We have been listening, little astropath. We have always been listening. The weapon's machine spirit failed then, its power cell dying with a pathetic whimper. I let it fall from my nerveless fingers, its impact lost beneath the growing rumble of the mountain's structural collapse. What do you want? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Want? The demon seemed genuinely puzzled, as if the question were quaint. We want nothing, little astropath. We have already won. The moment your god corpse expired, the galaxy became ours. Every world, every ship, every soul that once sheltered behind his light now belongs to the dark gods. We need do nothing but watch as your species devours itself in despair and madness. Another section of the ceiling gave way, and with it spilled more of that strange light, which was not light. In its glow, I saw other shapes moving, things with too many eyes or too few faces, appendages that mocked geometry, horrors given form. The sanctum that had been my refuge for over a century was transforming into a portal, a gateway through which the contents of the warp could pour into real space unchecked. I staggered toward the exit, but the ancient blast door was sealed, its machine spirit either dead or driven mad by the psychic storm. The control panel sparked and died beneath my touch. Sacred oils within its circuits ignited in a brief flare of holy fire before guttering out forever, leaving only the acrid stench of smoke. Where will you go, little astropath? The demon asked, its voice slithering across the collapsing chamber as I searched desperately for another way out. Your mountain fortress crumbles around you. Your god is dead. Your empire burns. What refuge remains for one such as you? The words struck deeper than any blade. For more than a century, my purpose had been clear. I was a servant of the Emperor, a guardian of his light, a conduit for his will across the unending dark between stars. But now, without him, what was I? Or any of us? The Imperium of Man had never been merely a political machine, never just a cluster of worlds held together by trade and military might. It had been faith made flesh, a dream of unity and destiny, given form by the Emperor's divine will. Now that faith lay in ruins, that dream revealed as nothing more than the fading hallucination of a being who had clung to life long beyond what was natural. Humanity was alone in the dark once more, as it had been in the Age of Strife, before the Emperor's great crusade had brought order to the scattered remnants of mankind. But this time was worse, infinitely worse, because now we knew what we had lost. The Vox channels crackled with chaos, reports of disaster and despair echoing from every corner of the Sol system. Terra's Hive cities were in open revolt, their faith broken by the sudden silence where once the Emperor's presence had burned bright. The Adeptus Arbites fought hopeless battles in the Underhive, their numbers overwhelmed by countless rioters. And worse still, some among the mobs began to twist and warp, their flesh reshaping itself in obscene patterns under the influence of chaotic energies, now bleeding unchecked into real space. On Luna, catastrophe unfolded within the gene laboratories of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The delicate templates that had birthed the legions of Astartes for 10,000 years were unraveling, their sacred patterns corroded by the touch of the warp. Even if the Imperium somehow survived the chaos of the moment, it would never again produce new angels of death. The Space Marines would fight their final wars with the warriors they had left. When they fell, there would be no replacements. Above Terra, the orbital defense platforms faltered. Void shields flickered fitfully, their machine spirits struggling against madness, while weapons batteries fell silent one by one. Should the forces of chaos strike now, they would find the heart of the Imperium nearly defenseless. Yet worse horrors still reached me through the channels. The Navigator houses, those ancient bloodlines whose gifts had carried humanity across the stars, were dying. Without the Astronomican's guiding light, their warp site was consumed by chaotic fire. Their third eyes burned out, leaving them blind, raving, or dead. Within hours, every navigator in the Sol system would be gone. Without them, no ship would dare the Immaterium. The Imperium's ability to move between stars was ending forever. And then, through the storm of desperate transmissions, another voice cut through. Cold recognition seized my heart. Lord Commander Militant Drakenvangerich, one of the High Lords of Terra, was speaking directly to the throne world itself. "Citizens of the Imperium," he began. His tone was steady, measured, but beneath the calm, I heard the thread of desperation. "We face a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. The Emperor, may his name be blessed, has been grievously wounded. His recovery is uncertain. Until he is restored to full strength, all Imperial citizens are ordered to remain calm. Maintain your posts. Maintain your faith." But I knew the truth. The Emperor was not wounded. He was gone. And no words, no edict, no desperate lie from the High Lords could disguise the reality that had shattered our galaxy. Any reports of the Emperor's death are to be considered heretical propaganda and will be punished accordingly. The words echoed through the Vox like a hollow prayer. The lie was almost laughable in its fragility, but I understood why it was spoken. If the truth spread, that the God Emperor was truly dead, the Imperium would collapse in a storm of panic and rebellion within hours. Better to preserve the illusion, to cling to the fiction of his survival for as long as possible. But for what purpose? There had never been a contingency plan for this. No protocol for the death of a god. The Imperium itself had been founded upon a single assumption, that the Emperor was eternal, his light unending, his will an immutable force against the chaos of the universe. That assumption had proven false, and now the galaxy was paying the price for millennia of arrogance. While I listened to the transmissions, the demon continued to grow. Its shape, once half shadow, was now entirely solid, every detail horrifyingly real. Nearly 3 meters tall, its chitinous hide shimmered with an oily iridescence, reflecting impossible colors that made the eyes ache. When it moved, the air itself seemed to twist, reality bending as though the laws of physics had become mere suggestions in its presence. "Your lords lie to preserve order," the demon said, its voice carrying a weight that crushed the air around me. "But lies cannot hold back truth forever. Already the faithful begin to doubt. Already the weak seek new gods to worship. We are patient, little astropath. We have waited 10,000 years for this moment. We can wait a few hours more for your species to accept its fate." Its certainty was terrifying because I knew it spoke truth. My thoughts turned to the billions of souls scattered across the galaxy. Men, women, and children suddenly cut off from the light that had guided them since birth. How long before they realized their prayers no longer reached any ear? How long before despair curdled into rage? Before faith curdled into heresy? On the agri-world of Siri Prime, I imagined Governor Marcus Aurelius already struggling to hold his people together as panic spread. The vast servitors that tended the crops, feeding half a sector, were failing, their machine spirits collapsing into madness. Hunger on a scale unseen since the age of strife loomed over them. a specter of starvation that no governor, however noble or just, could ever hope to drive away. Far away, the forge world of Lucius would face its own reckoning. For millennia, its tech priests had given their lives to the pursuit of knowledge, their creed that understanding itself was worship of the omniscient. But what would remain of their faith now, when the supposed object of that worship had been unmasked as mortal? Some would cling to their dogma, insisting the emperor had merely transcended to a higher plane of existence. Others would sink into despair, seeing only the proof that their entire philosophy had been a lie. And some, the most dangerous of all, would turn to forbidden paths, to the blasphemous sciences of chaos, hungering for truths denied to them for so long. And then there was Necroanda, the hive world of rust and blood. Its people had never known mercy, never expected salvation. Gang wars and industrial violence had hardened them into something less than hopeful, but more than resigned. For them, perhaps, the emperor's death would mean little. In lives so brutal and short, his light had always been a distant rumor, never a reality. They would continue as they always had, fighting, killing, surviving, oblivious to the greater doom consuming the stars. The demon was right. Lies cannot hold forever, and when the lie broke, the Imperium would shatter with it. But even on Necroanda, where life had been brutal for generations, the collapse of imperial authority would unleash chaos on a scale never before seen. The noble houses would turn upon one another in desperate struggles for dominance, while the underhive gangs would carve up the corpse of civilization, feasting on the ruin of order. And what of the Space Marine chapters, those post-human warriors who had been the Imperium's sword and shield for 10,000 years? Earlier, I had felt their psychic emanations ripple through the warp, confusion, disbelief, and despair as the realization spread that their father, their emperor, was truly gone. Some would endure, clinging to duty even in the face of final defeat. Yet others, those with unstable gene seed, cursed lineages, or lingering doubts about the imperial creed, might take his death as proof that their suspicions had always been correct. I could almost see it already. Chaos Space Marines rising in revolt, their corrupted warbands spreading carnage across the stars, while their loyalist brothers fought hopeless wars to preserve a dying dream. The thought filled me with despair so deep I nearly collapsed beneath its weight. Civil wars would erupt across the Imperium, wars so vast, so brutal, that even the Horus heresy itself would seem a minor border dispute in comparison. Another tremor rattled the mountain, but this time the quake was inside my skull. My wards and barriers, painstakingly built over decades of discipline, were cracking beneath the psychic pressure. The immaterium pressed against reality with such force that my senses faltered under the strain. Blood leaked from my nose and ears. I staggered, clutching at my temples as the carefully woven lattice of my mind began to unravel. The demon saw my agony and smiled. Its mouth split wide, revealing rows of obsidian teeth that gleamed like polished blades. "You feel it, don't you?" it whispered, every syllable vibrating against my bones. "The weight of truth pressing upon your fragile sanity. Soon you will accept what we have always known. Order is an illusion. Law is a lie. Only chaos is eternal." I tried to block it out, tried to summon the meditations that had carried me through decades of psychic trial. But what once came as naturally as breath now slipped from my grasp. Without the Emperor's light to anchor my soul, I was adrift in a storm with no horizon. The demon's voice, steady and insistent, became the only constant in the rising madness. The cracks in the walls widened. From them, more shapes emerged, things that defied description, beings that violated every principle of natural law. Some were mesmerizing, their alien beauty so flawless it hurt to look at them. Others were grotesque beyond words, hideous forms that mocked the very notion of creation. Yet all of them were wrong. They should not have been able to exist in real space. And yet here they were, undeniable proof that the walls between dimensions were failing faster than anyone had dared to imagine. One of them stepped forward, a shifting construction of living geometry that twisted into impossible patterns. To gaze upon it was to feel one's thoughts break apart. Its voice came not through my ears, but directly into my skull, like stone grinding against stone. "The great game begins anew," it declared. "For 10 millennia we were constrained, forced to work through mortal agents, through whispers in the dark. But now we are free, and the galaxy shall learn the true meaning of despair." I wanted to argue, to deny its words, but the evidence surrounded me. Failing machines, collapsing psychic networks, riots consuming Terra itself. Chaos was no longer at the gates, it was already within. Within hours, demons would walk openly in the streets of the imperial capital, and there would be nothing left to stop them. The Vox channels flickered and died, their machine spirits at last overwhelmed by the storm. The last clear transmission I received came from Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars. His voice, though distorted by the interference clawing at every channel, was still recognizably human, still carrying the iron weight of conviction. "All loyal servants of the Emperor," he declared, every word etched with grim determination. "This is Marshal Helbrecht, speaking from the battle barge Eternal Crusader. We have received reports of widespread disorder throughout the system, but we will not yield to despair. The Black Templars will continue our eternal crusade until the last of US falls. The Emperor may be gone, but his ideals survive in our hearts and our actions. We go now to make war upon the enemies of mankind, wherever they may be found. The Emperor protects, even in death." Then the transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only static to hiss in my ears. I sat in silence, knowing Helbrecht would be true to his word, knowing the Black Templars would fight to the last breath. But what could one chapter accomplish against the forces even now massing in the warp? They would die as heroes, certainly, but their heroism would change nothing. The galaxy belonged to chaos now, and no noble gesture could alter that fundamental truth. The demon that had been taunting me throughout this ordeal straightened suddenly, its golden eyes narrowing as if drawn to something far beyond the confines of the crumbling sanctum. When it spoke again, its voice trembled with something new, genuine excitement. "Ah," it hissed, eyes brightening like twin suns of molten metal. "It begins. The first of the great rituals is commencing. Can you feel it, little astropath? The weight of 10,000 years of accumulated faith and fear being unleashed all at once." I did feel it. The pressure building in the immaterium made all my previous suffering seem like a faint echo. Somewhere in the galaxy, one of the dark gods was beginning to manifest its full power into real space, no longer constrained by the Emperor's will, no longer bound by the laws of physics. The psychic shockwave of such an event would ripple through every world, touch every living soul, and the madness that followed would make our current crisis seem like a moment of perfect sanity. The floor beneath me buckled and cracked, the ancient stone unable to withstand the forces now unleashed. Through the widening fissures, I saw glimpses of other places, other times. A battlefield on some distant world where space marines fought desperately against a tide of demons. A hive city burning under a sky turned the color of blood. A forge world where tech priests dismantled their own augmentics in frenzies of self-destruction. All of it was happening now, simultaneously across the galaxy. The Emperor's death had not merely ended an era. It had torn holes in the fabric of space-time itself, allowing chaos to bleed through from every possible timeline and dimension. Past, present, and future were unraveling into meaningless concepts as reality itself came apart. I tried to stand, to flee the sanctum before it collapsed entirely, but my legs would no longer support me. The psychic pressure was crushing, driving me to my knees as my enhanced nervous system overloaded with sensory input from across the stars. I could hear everything. The screams of dying worlds, the triumphant laughter of demons, the desperate prayers of the faithful who had not yet realized their God no longer heard them. Through it all, the demon watched me. In its expression flickered something that might have been pity. "Do not struggle so, little astropath," it said, its voice now oddly gentle. "Your pain will end soon enough. When the transformation is complete, you will understand this was never an ending, but a beginning. Humanity's childhood is over. It is time to embrace a more mature relationship with the universe." And as the sanctum cracked apart around me, I understood that its words were not a threat, but a statement of fact. I wanted to spit defiance at the creature, to curse it and all its kind. Yet I could scarcely draw breath through the psychic storm tearing my consciousness apart. Instead of words of rage, my thoughts drifted back to the oath I had sworn when I first became an astropath, the vows of service and sacrifice that had defined more than a century of my life. "I will serve the Emperor until my death." I had spoken those words kneeling before his golden throne, while the ritual flames burned away my mortal sight. I will be his voice in the darkness, his light in the void, his will made manifest across the stars. Those vows had sustained me through countless trials, through moments of doubt, and through psychic assaults that threatened to break my sanity. And even now, with the Emperor gone and the oath seemingly rendered meaningless, I found comfort in their familiar cadence. Perhaps that was what separated humanity from the demons. Even in the face of utter defeat, we clung to principles, to ideals, to something greater than ourselves. We refused to be reduced to beasts scrabbling for survival in an uncaring void. The demon seemed to sense my thoughts. Its expression shifted, its golden eyes narrowing with something that resembled curiosity. "Fascinating," it mused, tilting its horned head. "Even now, with absolute proof of your god's mortality before you, you persist in faith. Tell me, little astropath, what is the point of believing in something that has demonstrably failed?" It was a fair question, one that had haunted me in the darkest hours of my service. Why continue to serve a being who permitted such suffering in his name? Why maintain faith in a system that crushed billions beneath the weight of order and progress? I had never found a perfect answer. Yet I had continued, always continued, because the alternative was worse. To abandon faith entirely was to embrace the very chaos and despair that now threatened to devour all that I loved. Because, I said at last, surprised at the steadiness of my voice, faith is not about whether the object of that faith deserves it. Faith is about choosing to believe that things can be better than they are, even when all evidence screams otherwise. The Emperor may be dead, but the ideals he embodied can live, if we choose to carry them forward. The demon laughed, but this time it was not mockery. It was something closer to amusement. "And what will you carry forward, little astropath? The rigid orthodoxy that smothered innovation for 10 millennia? The brutal repression that turned entire worlds into graveyards? The xenophobia that kept your species blind to the wisdom of others?" Each word struck me like a blade, because each contained truth. The Imperium had been many things, but kind and just were not among them. It had been ruthless, a necessary evil forged into a bulwark against the dark. It had sacrificed morality for survival, purity for endurance. Yet for all its cruelty, it had been better than the alternatives. Under its banner, humanity had spread across the galaxy. It had built cities and monuments that would endure for millennia. It had created art and philosophy that lifted the soul, even as the body bent under tyranny. "I will carry forward the part that mattered," I said, though the words trembled with uncertainty. "The part that said every human life has value. The part that refuses to surrender to despair. The part that looks at an impossible universe and still declares, we will make it better through our own efforts." For the first time, the demon faltered. Its monstrous shape flickered, turning momentarily translucent. And for an instant, I glimpsed something beneath the horror, something that might once have been human, long before it was twisted by the warp into what stood before me. "You speak of hope," it said at last, its voice carrying the faintest tremor of doubt. "But hope is the cruelest joke of all. We have watched civilizations rise and fall across the eons," the demon murmured, its voice like a tide washing over ancient stone. Each one believed it would be different. Each one was ground to dust by forces beyond its understanding or control. What makes you think humanity will be any different? It was another fair question, one I could not answer with any certainty. Every civilization did fall, eventually consumed by war, plague, or the slow erosion of time. The imperium of man had lasted longer than most, but even it now crumbled beneath the weight of its own contradictions. Perhaps the demon was right. Perhaps hope itself was just another form of delusion, a comforting lie to make existence bearable in the face of ultimate meaninglessness. Yet if that were true, then the demon's triumph was also meaningless. Chaos might devour order. Darkness might swallow light. But in the end, all of it would fade into nothing as the universe reached its cold, entropic death among the distant stars. If nothing truly mattered, then it did not matter whether humanity served the Emperor, the dark gods, or no gods at all. Maybe hope is a lie, I said at last, my words slow and deliberate as I traced their implications. Maybe we are all deluding ourselves about the possibility of lasting change. But if that's true, then your victory is equally hollow. Chaos may destroy order, but it cannot create anything meaningful to replace it. In the end, we are all just rearranging the furniture on a ship that's already sinking. The demon's form wavered, flickering like a shadow in candlelight. This time, I was certain I glimpsed something human in its molten eyes. "You understand more than most," it said quietly. "Perhaps that is why we have allowed you to live this long. Most mortals faced with the truth of their situation either go mad or surrender immediately. But you continue to think, to question, to resist, even when resistance is futile. It is almost admirable. Faint praise from a creature of pure evil should have meant nothing to me, but somehow it felt like a small victory. If I could maintain my humanity even here in the jaws of corruption, then perhaps others could as well. Perhaps somewhere in the galaxy, other servants of the Imperium were holding fast to their principles even as their worlds collapsed around them. Perhaps the light that had guided humanity for 10 millennia was not yet fully extinguished. The thought steadied me. It gave me enough strength to push myself back to my feet, though the effort left me dizzy and nauseous. The sanctum was barely recognizable now. Its walls crawled with writhing shadows that moved of their own accord, independent of any source of light. The blessed oils that had once kept the darkness at bay were long burned away, their protective influence replaced by the sickly phosphorescence leaking in from the warp. Yet I was still alive, still sane, still capable of thought and choice. That had to count for something, even in the face of cosmic indifference. The demon seemed to read my thoughts. Its expression shifted again, this time to something approaching respect. "You are stronger than I anticipated, little astropath," it said. "Most of your kind have already succumbed to madness or despair. Yet here you stand, clinging to your principles like a drowning man clutches driftwood. And what of you?" I asked, meeting its golden gaze without flinching. "You speak of the futility of hope, yet you seem genuinely interested in my responses. If nothing matters, why waste time in conversation with a dying mortal?" The question struck deeper than I had intended. The demon's form flickered once more, and for an instant I saw it clearly. A human soul, trapped within layer upon layer of demonic corruption. It had been a psyker once, like me, someone who had reached into the warp seeking knowledge or power, and instead found an eternity of bondage to forces beyond mortal comprehension. Because it whispered, its voice softer than before, "In 10,000 years of existence, you are the first mortal to ask me that question. The first to suggest that my choices might be as constrained as your own." The admission lingered between us like a fragile bridge stretched across an impossible gulf. This was no alien intelligence beyond comprehension, but something more disturbing. A creature of pure chaos admitting that it too was bound, just as helpless in its own way as those it tormented. Perhaps that was the truest horror of the warp. Not that it was unknowable, but that it was all too human in its contradictions, its pain, its endless cycles of suffering. Before I could respond, the sanctum shook with another tremor. This one was stronger than any before, strong enough to bring down what remained of the ceiling. Ancient stones crashed around us, and through the falling debris, I caught a glimpse of the sky beyond. What I saw froze me in terror. The stars were going out, not dimming, not flickering, simply ceasing to exist, snuffed from reality one by one as the expanding storms of chaos devoured them. Constellations that had guided humanity since its first tentative steps into the void were dissolving into an encroaching darkness that swallowed even light itself. The final phase, the demon said, following my gaze upward. Its golden eyes gleamed with something like reverence. With the Astronomicon extinguished, the warp storms are no longer constrained by geography or physics. They will expand until they consume everything, every star, every world, every trace of matter and energy in the galaxy. In the end, only chaos will remain, eternal, unchanging, perfect in its emptiness. I watched another constellation vanish, taking with it the light of 1 billion suns and the hopes of countless civilizations. Somewhere among those extinguished stars were worlds I had once touched in spirit, delivering messages of hope to isolated outposts clinging to survival in the dark. All of it, erased as if it had never existed. Despair threatened to crush me entirely. Yet, against all reason, my mind returned to the Black Templars and Marshal Helbrecht's final transmission. They had known the truth. They had understood their cause was hopeless. And still, they had chosen a fight, not because victory was possible, but because resistance itself held meaning, even in the shadow of inevitable defeat. Perhaps that was what the Emperor had truly represented. Not a god, not a savior, but a symbol. A living embodiment of humanity's refusal to surrender to the dark. His death had not diminished that symbol. If anything, it had revealed its truest form. The light that mattered was not the psychic beacon that once pierced the warp. It was the flame of defiance that burned in the hearts of those who dared to stand against the impossible. A flame that no demon, no god, no storm could ever extinguish. I turned back to the demon, its towering form already beginning to blur as the sanctum crumbled around us, stones raining down in thunderous collapse. You may be right about the futility of hope, I said, raising my voice to be heard above the chaos. But you are wrong about one thing. This is not an ending. It is a choice. The creature's head tilted, genuine curiosity flickering in its molten eyes. What choice? The choice to remain human, even when humanity itself is ending. The choice to hold fast to our principles, even when they serve no practical purpose. The choice to believe in something greater than ourselves, even when that something has already failed. The demon's laughter rolled out again, but it had changed. No longer mocking, it carried with it a note of sorrow, like a dirge echoing through the warp. And what will that choice accomplish, little astropath? It asked. The stars will still die. The galaxy will still be consumed. Your species will still face extinction. Maybe nothing, I admitted, my voice hoarse. But maybe everything. Perhaps somewhere out there, others are making the same choice. Perhaps the light that guided us for 10 millennia was never about one man upon a golden throne. Perhaps it was always about the collective decision of billions of souls to reject despair and embrace hope, no matter how foolish that hope may seem. The demon's form flickered one final time, and in that brief shimmer, I saw not a monster of chaos, but a fellow human being, trapped, corrupted, yet still faintly recognizable beneath the horror. I remember making that choice once, it said softly. Long ago, when I was still mortal. I wonder what might have been different if I'd held to it longer. And then it was gone, dissolving into the malignant energies of the warp that now filled the sanctum like a choking fog. I stood alone among the ruins, the shattered ceiling above me, the sound of Terra's death throes reverberating through the mountain's bones. I could have lain down there, surrendered to the rubble, let oblivion claim me before the greater horrors arrived. But that would have been surrender. And surrender was the one thing I could not allow, not while I still drew breath. So I moved, Picking my way through the debris, I searched for a path to the surface. It took nearly an hour to crawl through collapsed passageways, to climb emergency shafts once meant as escape routes, but now half-blocked by wreckage. By the time I emerged into the open air, Terra itself had already begun to transform into something unrecognizable. The sky was the color of clotted blood, veined with sickly green fissures that pulsed with their own alien light. In the distance, the mighty Hive spires burned, their adamantine shells cracking and splitting under pressures they had never been designed to withstand. The proud skyline of humanity's cradle world now looked like the funeral pyre of a species. But I was not alone. On the mountain's peak, scattered across the rocky plateau, I saw perhaps a dozen other figures. Some wore the robes of the Adeptus Astronomica. Others bore the battered armor of the Imperial Guard, or the simple, stained garments of palace servitors. All wore the same expression, stunned disbelief. They were men and women who had watched their universe collapse in the span of hours. One of them, a young woman whose astropathic tattoos were still fresh and dark against her pale skin, looked up as I approached. "Prime," she said, her voice steady though tears streaked her cheeks. "What are your orders?" "Orders?" The word nearly drew bitter laughter from my throat, though I forced it down. What orders could I give in the face of universal collapse? What command could address the death of hope itself? And yet, as I looked at those survivors, I realized the question mattered. They had not asked me for comfort. They had not asked for explanations. They had asked for orders, direction, purpose, some indication of how to proceed in a situation without precedent in human history. They did not see me as a source of answers. They saw me as a symbol, a fragment of continuity, a reminder that the structures and hierarchies that had sustained us for millennia still existed, if only in shadow. And for them, for all of us, that shadow was enough. "We survive," I said, the words escaping more easily than I would have imagined. "We bear witness. We remember what was, and we preserve what we can of what should be." It was not much of a plan, perhaps not even a plan at all. Yet in the chaos that was consuming everything we had ever known, it was something to cling to, something to anchor us against the storm. One by one, the other survivors nodded. In their eyes, I saw the same flame of defiance that had carried me through my confrontation with the demon. We were broken souls, fragments of a shattered imperium, clinging to the memory of a dead dream. But we were still human, still capable of choice, still able to decide what our final acts would mean, even with the galaxy collapsing around us. That was not nothing. That was everything. As the stars winked out above us and the heavens burned, we began the long, impossible task of bearing witness to humanity's final chapter. And in that simple act, in refusing to let the darkness claim the last traces of what we had been, perhaps we ensured that the light of human consciousness would never be entirely extinguished, no matter how deep the shadows grew. The Emperor was dead. With him, the Imperium of man died as well. But humanity endured, not in palaces of marble or fleets of steel, but in the fragile, stubborn hearts of those who chose to remain human even as the world collapsed around them. In the end, perhaps that was enough. The wind rose, carrying the acrid tang of burning cities and the distant echoes of laughter that belonged to no throat shaped by nature. But mingled with that was something else, something that took me a moment to recognize. It was singing, faint at first, carried from the dying high below, then stronger as I strained to hear. Human voices, not crying in despair, but raised in defiant song. They sang the old hymns, the ancient chants of faith and hope that had sustained their ancestors through 10 millennia of darkness. The words were broken by distance, yet their meaning was unmistakable. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. He could not protect them any longer. He had not protected them in the end. And yet they sang anyway. In that song was everything that had ever made humanity worth saving. Not perfection, not victory, but the stubborn refusal to surrender hope, even when all evidence demanded despair. I closed my eyes and let my own voice join theirs, whispering the familiar words into the night. The pain in my chest, heavy as stone, lifted just enough to let me breathe. Around me, the other survivors added their voices too, until our ragged chorus joined with the distant hymn, until it seemed as if all of terror itself was singing one last time. When the song ended, silence swept across the mountain. But it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was a silence alive with expectation, as though the universe itself paused, waiting to see what choice humanity would make in its final moments. We chose to endure. We chose to remember. We chose to remain human, no matter the cost. And in that choice, perhaps the Emperor found the immortality that had eluded him in life, not as a god upon a golden throne, but as an idea, as a symbol of everything in humanity worth preserving. The Imperium might fall. The galaxy might burn. But as long as even a single human soul remembered what it meant to hope in the face of despair, the Emperor would live on. The demon had been wrong about one thing. This was not an ending. It was a beginning.